Give just another minute or so to let the folks trickle in, and then we'll get started. Thank you. I'm seeing stabilized here at a population. Folks will trickle in as we're going, but that's fine too. Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend today's event entitled Rebranding the Russian Way of War, the Wagner Group's viral social media campaign and what it means for Ukraine. I'm optimistic that your time here, you'll sense, will be well spent listening to the two of our guests talk about the issues today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeff Kubiak, and I'm a professor of practice with the Center on the Future of War here at ASU, and I co-direct the Center's online M.A. in Global Security in the School of Politics and Global Studies. This event is one of a series that we run every semester, highlighting the important work being done by the faculty of the M.A. in Global Security. If you're not familiar with the degree, it is a fully online program taught by security practitioners for the security practitioner. The faculty includes some of the leading thinkers and researchers in the security arena, which definitely includes our guest today. So Candace Rondeaux, Professor Candace Rondeaux, is a professor of practice here at ASU's Center on the Future of War and directs a program called Future Frontlines at New America, our partner think tank in Washington, D.C. Future Frontlines is a public intelligence service for next generation security and democratic resilience. Of course, in my mind, first and foremost, Professor Rondeaux teaches courses here in the M.A. in Global Security, and she's presently teaching her course on proxy warfare in the current semester. By training and experience, Professor Rondeaux is a journalist and public policy analyst. She's a columnist for the World Politics Review and a contributing writer for the Daily Beast. Catalyzing the global human pursuit of dignity, justice, equity, transparency, and accountability is a through line in all of her work. Before joining New America, Candace served as the senior program officer at the U.S. Institute for Peace, where she launched the Resolve Network, a global research consortium on conflict and violent extremism, and as a strategic advisor to the U.S. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. She has documented and analyzed political violence in South Asia and around the world for the Washington Post and the International Crisis Group. She's joined today by her New America colleague, Ben Dalton, who is the program manager for New America's Future Frontlines program. Before joining New America, Ben worked as a journalist and communications officer and producer for BuzzFeed News, World Learning, and the International Crisis Group. His work has appeared in Slate, The Daily Beast, BuzzFeed News, The New York Times, PBS NewsHour, Al Jazeera, The Diplomat, Hum Daily, CNN.com, the Christian Science Monitor, Bedford and Bowery, and the New York Transatlantic, among other publications. So with that still modest introduction of my two friends here today, we have a really interesting topic to discuss, and I'm super excited about this because I have lots of deep interest in this phenomena of the PMC and the rise of the Wagner Group to where it is today. But get us started. Where did this all start for the two of you in your research? And kind of walk us from give us a chronology from the very beginning to today.
Thanks, Jeff. And it's really good to be here. I always love the ASU webinars because I know I get to speak to some of my students, but I have a funny feeling I'm speaking to some of my students' family and friends. So it's kind of nice to expand the circle and be known beyond the perimeters of the MAG's courses. And as well, just very grateful for you for giving us a chance to talk a little bit about our work. I guess, the origin story of this project, our work on the Wagner Group, which has been running since basically 2018, since I started working with ASU and also working with New America. The origin story comes from our Future of Proxy Warfare project, where Peter Bergen, myself, Daniel Rothenberg, and others who are affiliated with the Center on the Future of War began exploring questions about what's changed about proxy warfare. This was, of course, at a time when the Syrian civil war was morphing into a multi-state proxy war with Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Iran and the United States jumping in feet first into that conflict. It was also when Libya was, of course, exploding. Russia, of course, had been very involved in the Syrian conflict and so forth. And so I wanted to, one, help support the project work, but I was very keen to make sure that we looked at the two, I think, most pressing proxy wars that many folks were kind of underestimating the impact of. One was, of course, Ukraine, which of course had been going by then for 4 years, and the other was Syria. And already as early as 2015, 16, there were these rumors about this mysterious, shadowy mercenary group that somehow appeared on the battlefield of Donbass in eastern Ukraine, and then just as quickly as it appeared, disappeared and popped up again in Syria. And that was sort of like an interesting, intriguing problem. How did those guys connect to what was happening in Ukraine? How do they end up in Syria? So that was one question I had. And I really wanted to understand the networks, basically, that connected these individuals who seemed to be maybe part of the same command structure, maybe part of the same company. But I have a background in Russian area studies. I studied that as an undergrad when I was much younger than I am today. I spent a lot of time in St. Petersburg. Actually, that's where I spent my undergraduate, my final year of my undergraduate career. And then I went on to work as a literary translator in Russian, and spent a lot of time sort of working in the world of literary history and Russian historical projects and so forth and so on. And so a lot of this is also kind of a long-standing interest in the region. It was very much motivated by that, but I'm also very interested in military affairs, as is probably been well established. And when I realized that actually the strange, mysterious story about the origins of this group, the Wagner Group, really started with one man by the name of Dmitry Utkin, about whom the world knew very, very little. It occurred to me that we needed more information, but most of the reporting up until that point had been sort of anecdotal. Sightings of one guy here, sightings of another person over here in Syria, maybe somebody rocking up in Libya. And so the fundamental question was not only how are these networks of mysterious ghost warriors, ghost soldiers connected to each other, but how would you prove that they're connected to each other? Many people assume that they are, that it's some sort of unitary company called the Wagner Group. And that's where the open source investigation techniques began to kind of bubble up as a means and a method by which we could start testing assumptions about what was out there about the Wagner Group. But Ben probably has his own origin story for this as well.
Yes, well, so I came to this project a little bit later, although I share with Candace, a longstanding interest in sort of Russian affairs, the former Soviet world. I've at various times lived and worked in Russia or sort of countries along the periphery of Russia. And Candace and my sort of path has also crisscrossed in various interesting ways over the years. But so she reached out to me, I think it would have been in actually 2020, to see whether I would be interested in sort of helping with this research. And it's kind of been, that's how I got involved in the present sort of phase of research. Yeah, so it's been a lot of support for this research project over the last several years, and we were very excited to sort of see it bear fruit with a series of 5 reports that came out this past February on the anniversary of the 1-year full-scale invasion. And very happy and excited to be here and to talk about it with you.
So the Wagner Group, you hit on this a while ago, Candace. I know you've been working on this for several years, but clearly you picked a winner because it was a growth industry at the time, and you got in on the ground floor. So now you are one of the experts in something that is becoming very much a top level issue for folks who study war and conflict. Where are we at now with your understanding of what Wagner is? And I've got several other follow-on questions too that I think will help guide some of the discussion beyond that as well. But where are we now, and what are your thoughts on what Wagner is?
Yeah, so I think Wagner is a few things. So I think the best way to describe the Wagner Group is a paramilitary cartel. And that's a big mouthful. But what we mean by that is cartels, as a rule, they're defined by the fact that they want to control the price of the thing that they value and that they sell, right? They collaborate, or they conspire to fix prices, right? Or to essentially own a piece of the market, basically. In much the same way, as OPEC, right, which is one of the biggest cartels out there that controls the price of oil and so forth in oil production. essentially, the Wagner Group represents a group of men, mostly, who want to control the price of contract military services, and who want to control the price of the defense industrial offerings of the Russian state. So there's a big interlinkage between the Russian military proper, that's the conventional forces, the Army, Air Force, Navy, and so forth, and also the procurement and export arm of Russia's Ministry of Defense. This is known as essentially Rossborn Export is a subsidiary of Rostec, which is a giant arms dealer. But the backbone, the bureaucratic backbone of the Wagner Group stems from the contracting process that the Ministry of Defense undertakes to deploy, weapons and platforms out into the world. So, for instance, the Ministry of Defense oversees military technical agreements with countries like the Central African Republic or Libya or Syria. And these are all places that we know that the so-called Wagner Group has a presence, basically. And of course, most famously, the Central African Republic has been a place where they've been able to blossom and bloom over the last, I guess, 5 years now, since they started their presence there in 2018. So where are we now with the Wagner Group is the question. I mean, we are where we were circa 1950 in some ways. In many ways, the Wagner Group replicates the same logistics networks that were in place during the Cold War. So hence you'll find, for instance, in the Pentagon leaks, there was a question raised about some mentions of Wagner Group having approached officials in Turkey about purchasing and or bringing weapons to and from the country. Now, some people found that very surprising, including some of the New York Times reporters that I talked to about this issue. I did not find it surprising because actually there is a part of Turkey that has long had sympathies with Moscow, dating way back to the Cold War era, when the Soviet Union tried to cultivate communist partisan movements in the Middle East. And that's also true of Syria. It just so happens that Syria, has in place a dominant governance there. So where we are now is kind of where we are, where we were about 50 years ago, 60 years ago, at the peak of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were locked in this competition with each other and trying to find ways into dominating the arms industry in Africa and Latin America and the Middle East. That's very much the case today. I think the big difference is, of course, the Ukraine factor. Ukraine has kind of blown the lid off of any kind of illusions that these are independent actors that have no real association with the Ministry of Defense or the Kremlin, that they're operating completely on their own resolve and that they are purely private. I think what we now know, especially from our research, is that if there is any measure of privacy or sort of private actors within the Wagner Group, it is minuscule at best. This is a from end to end state enterprise, from the Kremlin all the way down to the last infantrymen sitting in Bakhmut today. And we know that also because of course, the prison recruitment scheme has been, I think, the biggest piece of evidence that has, disabused the world of the notion that this is a completely private enterprise. In order to recruit, some 30,000 prisoners and field them out into the front lines, you have to have the cooperation of the state. And I think that's what we're seeing now.
So despite the fact that they have the whole illusion of the privacy part or the private actor part is gone, what kind of principal agent relationship does the Kremlin have with regards to its oversight of where Wagner's acting and for whom they're acting, which is a question in the question block. Does Wagner act actually in the interest of other state actors or non-state actors besides the Kremlin?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. So I think it's important to keep in mind that there's another piece of the cartel. So there are the foot soldiers of the cartel, right? The guys that we see in Bakhmut or Syria or Central African Republic. Those are the guys with the guns and so forth. There are the middlemen of the cartel, and that's Yevgeny Prigozhin, who we've now become very familiar with, this the man known the world over as Putin's chef, who is a longtime, associate and confidant, apparently, of President Vladimir Putin. So he's sort of one of several middlemen, actually, but he's a very important and very prominent one. And then there are the financiers and stakeholders at the other end. And I think those individuals have not received nearly enough attention in terms of principal-agent relations. I would consider those individuals, that is the heads of Rostec, which is the state arms dealer, the head of Gazprom, the head of Stroytransgaz, which is a very large energy production and engineering firm. These are all predominantly state-owned. That is to say, the state has the majority shares of these enterprises. And in fact, in most cases, with I think one exception, the president of Russia appoints the CEO of these state corporations. Example, Rostec, the CEO, Sergei Chemezov, has been appointed by Vladimir Putin, okay? Because it's considered a state enterprise, therefore the state gets to choose who gets to run it, basically. This is where people often sort of say, well, isn't it like Blackwater? Well, no, not quite, in a couple of different ways. One, it's the foot soldiers aren't private, the middlemen aren't really particularly private, and the financiers are not particularly private. But two, most importantly, the state has ownership of every piece of this puzzle, basically. But in terms of principal-agent relations, you kind of have two types of principals. You have the corporate heads, right? The kind of heads of Rostec and so forth, who do a lot of the work of financing, organizing, overseeing the management on some level. And then you have the second kind of principle, which is the political principle, right? Which is, of course, the Russian state itself, meaning mostly the Kremlin, and largely, of course, President Putin himself. And there, I think, what you're alluding to is this very, very high-profile tension between Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, and of course, the Army Chief of Staff, Valery Gerasimov. This three-way relationship has always been extremely fraught, in large part because one thing is that the laws that allow for the deployment of mercenary or contract soldiers are often contradictory, and therefore it's difficult for these middlemen like Yevgeny Prigozhin to navigate and profit in the way that I think that he would like to. But also, I think it's important to note that Ukraine represents a different type of warfare than Syria. The ways in which the Wagner Group has been involved is much more right on the front, much more kinetic, much more operational, right in the mix of things, as opposed to Syria, where of course they were fighting, but often in the shadows and usually working to train other proxies. And so I think what we can say about Ukraine is it's really greatly complicated the principal-agent relationship.
Yeah, Ben, did you have something to add? I don't want to leave you out of this conversation. I know you've got your own ideas here.
Yeah, so just quick add-on to that. It sometimes seems to me that Russia has a very interesting culture of like political entrepreneurship, particularly for people who are not at the very top, but the people like Prigozhin who sort of operate more in that middle section, where they're given a degree of latitude to, operate. But they're kind of like left guessing exactly what the bosses at the very, very top want to see. And so they experiment, and sometimes they get sort of slapped back down if they err in the wrong direction. And I think that can account for some, and part of this is also in the interests of the people at the very top, because if you keep everybody guessing off their footing, they tend to sort of like feud with each other, relations tend to spoil, and this ultimately provides a degree of protection for those at the very top. And I think this can account for a lot of the perhaps erratic or dramatic behavior that you see out of Prigozhin in the last 6-8 months or so.
Yeah, that's the interesting piece, because Prigozhin's obviously his stature has elevated at least in the global media, because we know who he is now. He shows up. He's almost every day or every other day he's showing up on some news story. So his personality is his persona within the domestic politics of the Kremlin have gone way up, but is he setting himself up to be the fall guy for, and the Wagner group be the fall guys, if you will, for whatever failures Russia suffers in Ukraine?
Look, I think everybody's being set up to be the fall guy for the failures of Ukraine, the Ukraine strategy. And I'll keep it short because I would like to hear actually Ben's answer. But I will say I think the political peacocking is actually a lot more about insulating himself from the prospect of becoming expendable. I mean, again, I've said this before, everybody's very fixed on what happens in Bakhmut, right? I mean, I think whatever way it falls, whether it's, in favor of the Ukrainians or in favor of the Russians, that will be a culminating moment. It will be an important moment for Prigozhin politically. It will tell, it will be basically the proof in the pudding as to whether or not he really is the kind of, military strategist genius that he purports to be. If even in the event that Russia is victorious in Bakhmut, it does not necessarily leave him less vulnerable. In fact, it makes him more vulnerable in some ways, because people will start to see him as somebody who's accumulating power. And I suspect that he understands quite well that the theatrics are going to be an important insulation for him.
Yeah, people who accumulate power in that regime tend to have some sort of stability problem when they stand in a window. But Ben, what do you got? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that when we look back at the history of the war in however many years, we might say that this past January was like the high watermark for Prigozhin's sort of influence and power. Right after predominantly his forces were responsible for taking the town of Soledar, close to Bakhmut. Yeah, and then since then we've seen extensive feuding with people who are more powerful than him. And we've seen him sort of get smacked down a little bit, losing access to his prisoner recruiting pipeline, which drastically decreases the number of men that he actually has operational in Ukraine.
So that maneuver, cutting off the criminal recruitment, if you will, or the prisoner recruitment, that was a political act by the higher ups to shut down Prigozhin and the Wagner group at some level to make the recruiting problems just harder.
Yeah, I think that you could definitely read it that way. And there was reporting that the Ministry of Defense was instead going to take over that recruiting. Now there's been reports that maybe Wagner will get access again. So, but definitely, a less secure position than he was in as recently as January. I see his like very public pronouncements. Candace refers to him as like the Ronald McDonald of Wagner, which I think is brilliant. But so yeah, the public sort of lane that he's chosen to occupy, you could see it almost as like a sign of weakness. People who wield real power in Russia often sort of don't need to go that public route. Public opinion doesn't count for very much in Russia's political system. And yeah, so I see it as a sign of I don't know, not quite desperation, but of weakness. And what he's really trying to do is kind of make himself the face of a growing mass movement of the ultra right within Russia, which might eventually become useful if we see Russia begin to sort of undergo what some people are talking about as like a great divorce, but further fragmentation. Maybe that would come into use down the line. Right now, to me, it feels like uncertainty and weakness.
That's really interesting. Of course, my biggest interest in this with regards to the Wagner Group and Prigozhin in particular is the dynamics that the increasing power that Wagner seems to have within the Russian way of war actually increases the status of Wagner inside the domestic polity of Russia. Putin, over his 20 plus years of being in control, has narrowed his power vertical pretty tightly. And it seems to me it will be fairly fragile and susceptible to big perturbations, if you will. And the Wagner group kind of represents that in my mind in some ways. Am I off the mark there? Is this something that's going to create a wobble in the power vertical for Putin at some point in time? Or is this something that he can dismiss or incorporate into the situation?
It's a mutual love club. So I think it's really, one, I would just say, I think there's a great temptation to overinterpret Putin's vertical. It's totally true. There is something there. It's important to be close to Putin. It's important to have his good favor. But it is equally important to have the good favor of the people who finance the entire enterprise of Putinism. And that's where, again, this inner circle of basically the cartel financiers becomes extremely important. I'm going to give you an example. There's been a great deal of controversy over Telegram, which is an app that has now, of course, now the world now knows Telegram. Many years ago, people didn't know it, but it's very popular with Russian speakers. It was invented by Pavel Durov, who is a brilliant computer scientist and mathematician, who also invented another platform called the Contactia, which we spent a lot of time looking at. Recently, there's been a great deal of controversy over the fact that Telegram is the host of many very critical voices of the Putin regime and of the war in particular. And of course, we had the bombing and the killing of Maxim Fomin or Vladimir Tatarsky very recently in St. Petersburg as kind of one of the, one of the very most popular military bloggers out there, one of these ultranationalist pro-Wagner group types. What we're seeing now is the head of Rostec, right, one of the most powerful weapons dealers in the world, one of the most wealthy individuals in the world, trying to find a way to control Telegram because there's been too much critical information and criticism of the way the war is being prosecuted in Ukraine on those channels. And in particular, there's been a great deal of mention of how Rostec has been dealing with the shortages of ammunition and shells and artillery and so forth. What's the point of all that? The point is that the vertical is not that vertical. It's not, just a straight up pyramid, but in fact, it rests in also kind of an acceptance of a kleptocracy model of governance, right? And most people who are wealthy, they tend to benefit from that. But the ones who don't benefit, right, are the ones with the sticky criminal past, like Yevgeny Prigozhin. The difference between Yevgeny Prigozhin and Sergei Chemezov is that, Chemezov was a KGB agent. He was very close to Putin. So he was Mr. Clean by comparison to Yevgeny Prigozhin, who spent 10 years in prison, basically, for various violent crimes. In today's Russia, I think Ben is quite right that power is really is not expressed in a public fashion. It's not where it really lives. But it is important that these ultranationalists have a place now, mainly because without them, Putin cannot prosecute this war. Without them, he would not be able to mobilize forces on the sly and pretend that there is no war going on. They're still calling it a special military operation. So people like Yevgeny Prigozhin and even the Wagner Group as an idea are really important for branding what is essentially an exercise in rule breaking and branding a stealth mobilization that otherwise might actually bring more people out on the street and engender more domestic resistance to the project.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It actually brings up a couple of different issues in my mind. One is the evolution of Wagner as a result of the special military operation in Ukraine, because you laid this out as being something of a just an extension of some foreign policy kind of globally for Putin's Russia, but has become kind of the central contributor for real fighting forces in that special military operation that Putin can ill afford to have go poorly. How do you see that as having what kind of effect? I mean, the title of our talk today was about how it's changed the Russian way of war. Is this over the course of the last 14 months been a real shift in the fundamental Russian way of war because of Wagner?
I actually would say yes. I think there's some things that are recognizable from past iterations. So even sort of partisan guerrilla warfare, the use of fictional units, fictional divisions, which basically the Wagner Group is basically a ghost unit that's embedded in many different other units, right? I mean, it now has its much more form than it did maybe like a year ago, but nonetheless, we know that the command structure draws from many different units. I would say that there are some very recognizable historical pieces of the Russian way of war that you can sort of see, particularly around deception operations. That's extremely key. There you see some of the same techniques, same tools, same tropes even, and then the use of information warfare, to kind of boost that deception, right? Both online and offline in different formats. Certainly, I think there are recognizable hallmarks of the Russian way of war. What has most certainly changed is, I think, the seeming relative autonomy that these rather specialized irregular forces seem to have. I wouldn't say that they're divorced from the main chain of command, but they seem to have much more autonomy than I think we've seen in other iterations.
Interesting. Ben, you have any other ideas about how maybe the invasion has changed the Russian way of war based upon Wagner's participation?
Yeah, I mean, within Wagner itself, you really see this like two-tier structure, right? So there's the core is the same as it was, which is largely special forces veterans, particularly the people who served in reconnaissance, sabotage units that are designed to go deep behind enemy lines and wreak havoc, which is always, as I understand it, been a major feature of the Russian way of war. And then, numerically, this is like a relatively small portion of the number of Wagner guys who are now fighting in Ukraine, because they're using all of these vastly less trained, essentially barely trained at all, cannon fodder recruits. And I think it's absolutely right. We're seeing a fair amount of like autonomy. The thing that I am very interested in is the exact sort of like structure of the command structure, right? And this is something that has been a major focus of our work and will continue to be.
Yeah, well, let's do that. So actually, there's a couple of questions in the question and answer block I want to get to real quick, and one has to do with recruiting. Quite frankly, there's Candace, you mentioned that the Wagner group in a lot of ways helps relieve some of the domestic pressures on Putin because it's an informal, it's a under the table kind of recruitment process, and yet is that in some ways creating some sort of dependency on Wagner by Putin in order to do that? And then does he lose some of his power and control over Wagner because he has to depend on them to recruit, because he can't go out to the public? Although I just noticed this week he has in fact sent out electronic notifications of mobilization, which also complicate things for everyone.
Well, it's interesting. I would characterize the recruitment as more ad hoc than informal. And there's a real distinction between the two. So ad hoc in the sense that I don't think in 2014, before the Euromaidan crisis began in Kyiv and things began to bubble and Donbass was destabilized and Crimea was annexed, I don't think before that there was a lot of forethought about the means by which they would take on volunteer contract soldiers. I think what was in place in terms of administration, bureaucracy, organizing all of that was pretty rudimentary, because it would have been the first time for Russia to try and field that type of force. In fact, the special forces, as consolidated today, is a relatively new format for the Russian military. It's still the case that you have Spetsnaz, which is, unlike the United States military, where you have the 4 branches and then the 4 special services. Yes, you have a kind of parallel there, but they're scattered throughout. So you'll have maybe a specialist, in intelligence from GRU scattered in a particular army unit, just as an example. So it's a little bit different. All this to say, simply in 2014, the bureaucracy was simply very rudimentary. Over time, I think what Ukraine, the full invasion of Ukraine has done is kind of served as a forcing function, because you need more people. Okay, in this instance, you don't need just 20 guys and you send them out, to do a little recon and sabotage. In this instance, you need, several tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And how are you going to do that? Well, first you need the bureaucracy to do it. And so in actual fact, there is a very formal structure called DOSAF, where youth camps and youth activities, veterans groups that are registered with the state serve as the conduit for a lot of the recruitment. But the informal part and the more kind of like creative entrepreneurial part is the online recruitment. And I think that's where we spent a lot of time looking at the way social media has been used to create the image, of these stealthy warriors who can get out there and beat the West at their own game. But I think Ben has done a lot of work in this area. I'd like to hear from him too.
Yeah. So one way to think about Wagner in Russia is that it sort of exists at the nexus of sort of Russia's far right movement, special forces, military intelligence, irregular paramilitaries, and then critically like the Kremlin's media machine, right? So one thing that we've taken a look at over the last year is the rise of these like so-called military bloggers who are mostly on Telegram, which is a messaging platform, or rather a social media platform masquerading as a messaging platform, right? You can attract enormous audiences, hundreds of thousands, in some cases, millions of followers who just sort of, you can feed a steady drip of updates. And since the 2022 full-scale invasion, we've seen a class of identifiable like bloggers. Candace mentioned Maxim Fomin, better known by his pseudonym Vladlen Tatarsky. It's probably the most prominent of them. And they've managed to attract these enormous audiences. And I kind of think of them as like occupying now the commanding heights of media discourse within Russia. Sort of like a couple of years ago, you could almost feel like you could predict tomorrow's headlines if you like followed the right people on Twitter. It's kind of like that, I think, right now on Telegram, where the narratives and the discourse that percolates throughout the rest of the media ecosystem have their origin in these like very influential military bloggers. They're not, a monolith. Some of them are a little bit more closely affiliated with like Ministry of Defense. The ones that we looked at most closely are specifically very closely connected to the Wagner group. So like, for instance, Tatarsky himself, he was a Ukrainian living in the eastern half of the country, actually got in trouble for robbing a bank, 2011, served 3 years until he was freed by one of the separatist militias, went on to serve in a series of units associated with the so-called Luhansk People's Republic, before sort of transitioning into this more like media influencer role. And was so successful that he was, in the midst of sort of breaking out, appearing on like mainstream Russian media, holding conferences and so forth. And one of the very few figures who was permitted to, voice criticism of officials, because he did so sort of from the right, advocating a greater, more bellicose position, greater sort of commitment to the war effort. And tremendously helpful to recruitment, because he as a very influential sort of propagandistic voice, able to spin a narrative that with these like very strong ultranationalist overtones that encourages people to sort of sign up for this heroic defense of the nation.
That's interesting, and actually sets up this next question really well, because one of the things about Russia is it has certainly in my lifetime has this image of itself as a global superpower, right? It once was as part of the Soviet Union, and Putin for sure resents ever being considered something less than that by any sort of imagination. Which means they have a global reach, and actually they still have global connections. You mentioned this early on in the conversation, that part and parcel to what Wagner does is export some things, oftentimes arms, but also other things, right? So one of the questions in the question block, which I think is really interesting, where might we see Wagner, or where might we not see Wagner? Where might Wagner be where we don't see them in support of Russian interests and in making money?
You will not see Wagner anywhere unless the Russian state is there. They are genuinely an extension of the Russian state. But one of the things that's interesting, we don't talk very much about this. There's been so much press attention on Ukraine, on Africa, But in fact, there is a presence in Venezuela, also in Nicaragua and in Cuba. Now, those are three countries that historically, again, just going back to the old Cold War playbook, have always had a very special relationship with Moscow because of their, at the time, very pro-communist or pro-socialist views on the world and on governance. And the model that they undertook, of course, borrowed quite a lot from the Soviet Communist Party of the time. And there was, of course, a great deal of interchange and trade and so forth. So these historical paths are there. In the case of Venezuela, what's been really interesting to track, at least for me anyway, is when Hugo Chavez became, progressively the pariah that he is now known to be today, and when the sanctions that the U.S. began to oppose under the Trump administration began to truly bite in Venezuela, the first thing to happen was a reorganization of both Rostec and Rosneft, which is the large oil company, basically a reorganization of their Venezuela-based organizations, right, and the companies there. And then suddenly you hear these stories of masked men, in camouflage, little green men rocking up in Venezuela, and everybody thinking, oh no, is Russia invading Venezuela? Well, of course not. That's not really what's happening. What's really happening is, again, a military technical agreement has been reached, and because of sanctions kind of imposing new constraints around that set of relationships, in comes the cavalry to help reshape the situation on the ground. And that's true in Central African Republic. That's true in, I think we'll see probably in Burkina Faso very soon, an expansion of the presence there, Mali as well. But in terms of the profit-making piece, I think this is an important thing to talk about. I think people underestimate the impact of these global sanctions on Russia. One very important impact is the need for hard revenues, hard currency. You can't get dollars if you're a Russian businessman today very easily, and you can't get dollars if you're a Russian government official for sure. Just hard to come by because you're most likely somewhere on the sanctions list, or somebody that you know, right? And so how do you go about doing that? Well, you find commodities that are easily cashable. So diamonds, rubies, gold, and sometimes even, in some cases, oil. You can certainly illicitly traffic in oil and find an open market for that kind of thing. Typically, though, in both of these cases, with minerals and oil and even potentially gas, but mostly those more liquid and material solid commodities, in those instances, the buyers are big, and this comes back to the cartel piece. On the one hand, you have Rosneft, for instance, or Gazprom, or some large mineral exploitation company based in Russia, saying, we'll pay you in diamonds, Wagner Group guys, as long as you protect this space. And you take those diamonds and you go over to Dubai or wherever you need to go, and you can cash those out, but we get a percentage of the cash out, basically. And so that's kind of this very interesting kind of synergistic relationship between the guys with the guns, the middlemen, and the financiers, but more importantly, the brokers in places like Dubai.
So one thing I just want to add on a little bit there. So one way that I think about Wagner is that it is part of the vanguard of Russia's geostrategic ambitions, right? They aren't not the vanguard, but they're part of it. So anywhere that, as Candace just said, anywhere that Russia wants to do business or wield influence, you'll find them there. They're low cost, they're flexible, they're disposable. But I would just add that they specifically do well in places where the state is incredibly weak and where they can identify a viable fissure, which is why they're expanding so rapidly in sort of West Africa, where France is the historical hegemon. And they're just exceptionally adept at identifying schisms because, another thing is that, they really represent a suite of services. It's not just security services. They, will deploy sociologists to do surveys, find out where the fault lines lie within that society, and then they will follow that up with influence campaigns at the top, with prominent media figures, and at the bottom with social media. So, anywhere where that sort of set of factors exists, I think you could eventually expect to find them.
That's fascinating. It's all very fascinating. I think this whole idea of this kind of networked, the process of all the different actors, especially the finance piece being such a big part of it, is really interesting and oftentimes overlooked, easily missed in certainly if you're just watching news headlines. But that's a really critical piece, as you mentioned, Candace, and it would talk to any kind of strategy if you're going to work against a state that tries to employ somebody like Wagner. A couple questions going on in the question box here. Is the Wagner group becoming a de facto easy button for Putin? And if so, at what point do you think he'll no longer be able to rely on Prigozhin and the Wagner to do his bidding? Does the principal agent problem get worse as apparently he continues to increasingly rely on Prigozhin to pull some really powerful moves for him?
Well, that's an important question to ask and to try and answer. As I mentioned, I think so. Prigozhin is one of I think a couple of maybe 4 or 5 really important middlemen, and he represents a cluster of military security contracting contingents that I think are largely associated with an organization called the Moran Security Group for the most part. There is another set called PMC Reddit, and we've been looking a little bit at them, and they bubbled up a little bit in the news. If you've been following closely anything in Ukraine, you'll know that there's another kind of competing entity, so to speak, alongside the Wagner Group. Less talked about, less well known, but certainly very effective and very stealthy, largely consisting of GRU special forces officers for the most part. They have not been trafficking very heavily in prisoners as far as we know, although they may have some. So in fact, much more adept in many ways. So if the question is, has the Wagner Group become an easy button for Putin? I think the answer is Russian irregulars have become an easy button, not just the Wagner Group. It's far more easy to deploy a force outside of the very broken bureaucracy of the conventional military. Unfortunately, despite Russia's so-called superpower status, it hasn't been able to overcome the basics of force mobilization. And that's one of the things that kind of raises questions about how we qualify what is a superpower and what is not a superpower. That being said, excuse me, I think it's important to kind of keep in mind that Prigozhin is expendable and replaceable, and so are the men who fight on his behalf. And I think we should absolutely anticipate that at some point in this war, we will see him either disappear from the scene or be disappeared from the scene.
Well, later prediction out there. We're gonna know now. See, I had another question that was brewing in my head, but I'll go to the question and answer block here. Let's see. Do you think the presence of the Wagner Group in Africa is similar to the geopolitical influence of China in the region with the Belt Road Initiative? That's an interesting comparison contrast, right? The role of the various state sponsors, if you will, of influence campaigns, one particularly economically oriented and the other one maybe security oriented. How do you see those interacting when they come to the same field?
This is the $64,000 question: is when will we see the special relationship between Beijing and Moscow? When will we see that converge more and more in the information space? I think we already kind of see that there's alignment on trying to destabilize or box in the United States and its NATO partners. I think there's alignment there, but then there are nuances after that, right? And it is true that in Africa, just as an example, China is viewed very differently by African nations than Russia. What China has been offering is, that's right, infrastructure, trade, development, where Russia has been offering that plus, right? It's been offering that in little pieces of sort of, mining contracts and gas and oil contracts, but nothing on the order of China in terms of building actual infrastructure. The infrastructure that they're building is the security forces. So I think, the answer varies by continent, by comparison, and I think Ben probably could speak to this better since he spent a lot of time in Central Asia. Central Asia is going to be an interesting battlefield for influence for both Russia and China. As Russia starts to lose its economic influence and its kind of potency economically, I think we're already starting to see that. And as the war continues to erode its credibility as a superpower, then the question becomes for Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and other trade partners, well, maybe we should be listening to this other influence campaign that China has been promoting. What do you think, Ben?
Yeah, I mean, Central Asia is a really interesting one. It's been for a while now that China is now the largest sort of trade partner for the region. But Russia remains, as we saw 2 Januaries ago, still very much the security guarantor when they sort of deployed forces to Kazakhstan. The two countries have been very scrupulous about playing nicely with each other. And I don't see that changing anytime in the near future. In Africa, they've largely stayed out of each other's way, as far as I can tell, with and also focused on sort of different kinds of states, where China seems to prefer to do business with, much more sort of, places that have greater state capacity. And Russia really is like a bit of like a chaos agent, and specifically targets, as I said before, weaker and less stable states. I'll also note there's just like the remarkable difference in tone between the two countries' state media or just sort of like messaging, where you go to like Chinese state media, it's like, oh, look at this like lovely panda, look at these this beautiful countryside, look at like the high quality of life under China, whereas Russia is like, the degenerate West is undermining our core values and whatnot. It's just an entirely different messaging approach. Personally, I would not be surprised to find the former, the Chinese model, ultimately more successful, but it will be interesting to see how it develops.
Having a positive narrative is almost always a little bit more likely to succeed long term than purely a negative one. And the Russians really haven't had a positive narrative since the collapse of the Soviet Union just before. So that's really interesting. I think one of the questions that kind of keep coming back to my head, though, is this idea of that Ukraine has fundamentally shifted the role of Wagner in some ways, and one of them is this recruiting piece, right? It's actually keeping, in a lot of ways, in some ways, the pressure off of Putin domestically, because they can recruit and train and do those sort of things kind of outside of the public eye. Where's a limit to that? Or is there a limit to that? And does that create a crisis at some point in time that Putin will not be able to cope with when it comes to fielding forces sufficient to, continue or hold in Ukraine?
Well, I think we've begun to see the edges of those limits for sure. I mean, there are maybe 2 or 3 precipitating events that I think have constrained the ability of those connected to the Wagner Group and Prigozhin, constrain their ability to really mobilize forces now and to do recruitment. The first, of course, is just the prison video itself. I mean, famously, of course, Evgeny Prigozhin last year is pictured on in a prison courtyard, urging people to join up or don't. But if you do join up, you'll probably die. But you'll die a hero's death. That was the message, which is quite amazing, actually, as a recruitment campaign ad. I think it's very telling. But it's still, the world was horrified, by that video, and I think for the first time you start to feel tremors in the Kremlin as a result of the global approbation around the use of prisoners and really forcing people who really have no choice. I mean, basically gang pressing, tens of thousands of men and sending them basically into their death. So that's number one. And then number two is, the conduct on the field seems to be such that the forces are largely very indisciplined. Those who are part of the officer corps or field command may have been recruited from the FSB, the Federal Security Services, or from MVD, Interior Troops, or or other agencies, and many of them have defected very publicly. We saw, of course, in late November, early January, Andrei Medvedev, a former Wagner field group commander, who literally ran across the frozen tundra, from St. Petersburg, allegedly, through Finland, over to Norway, and crossing one of the most highly guarded borders in the world in order to escape the Wagner group. And the stories that he has come out with about the torture, the extrajudicial killings, the abuse, the cannon fodder-like treatment of the troops on the field, I think that too was a big inflection point that really undercut the sort of saleability of the Wagner Group brand. And last but not least, I don't think that the public fighting and fisticuffs, so to speak, or verbal fisticuffs with Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Prigozhin has helped Prigozhin's credibility, or has helped the brand very much. It may help with a small group of the ultranationalists, but I don't think it helps his credibility, or it does much to kind of expand the brand name. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see. As I said, I do think that Bakhmut, whatever way it falls, will be that last inflection point that determines whether or not it's just too much, basically, and whether or not they need to kind of revamp their approach to this stealth mobilization.
Just quickly to add on there, I remember when Prigozhin gave that prison speech, or those prison speeches, there was a lot of praise amongst these like military bloggers about just how like forthright and like man-to-man he was being. But really, I think the fact that he was able to get so many people to sign up really speaks to how absolutely horrifying Russian prison has to be. So like Nuzhin, one of the men who was executed with a sledgehammer last fall on video, he had, I think, served the vast majority of his prison sentence, and still leapt at the possibility to go to Ukraine. I think it's also interesting. So, back in the fall, there was some reporting about how Wagner was using these like disciplinary units that, essentially killed anybody who refused to take part in these human wave attacks. And they stopped doing that around December because word got out, and it made the recruiting dry up.
Interesting. So that's one of the questions that, again, that comes back for folks who study warfare, especially in something of a more kind of conventional state-on-state context, is this idea of the laws of war. Clearly, war crimes are being committed by the Russian state, and I mean, it did once it crossed the border, quite frankly, in 2014, for that matter. But it's gotten worse, quite frankly, a lot. But several of the war crimes, severest war crimes, are being committed by those who are actually operating as private military contractors. How does that play out internationally? And I guess I'm going to ask this as the last question. There's a couple other questions in the question and answer block. I'll copy and paste those into an email and send them to Candace and Ben. You guys can kind of reply at your leisure. But in terms of the war crimes and law of war, where does the PMC like Wagner stand and fit into that conversation internationally?
I'll try and make it quick. So I think that there are kind of two tracks that we're going to be looking at when it comes to responsibility for potential atrocities in the context of Ukraine and maybe other places as well. First, always under the law of war and law of armed conflict is the question of individual liability. So who was there in the scene at the crime? That's pretty basic. And I definitely think we've already seen charges against a number of Wagner Group commanders and foot soldiers very early on, as early as I think April or May of last year, when the Ukrainians managed to push the Russians out of Kyiv. Immediately came a set of charges against, I think, 3 Wagner Group fighters who were involved in the kidnapping of a local official and also a mass grave situation there. So I think, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we'll see many, many, many more individual liability cases like that, and we can point to different chains across the way in Mariupol and certainly Bakhmut, Soledar. But then there's the question, which I think you're kind of alluding to here, which is is it private? How private is this PMC? And is it taking orders from the state? If so, under what circumstances? Because then it becomes a question of, well, was that individual taking orders from as high as the Kremlin? And I think that's the work ahead, is trying to figure out whether you can answer that question clearly, first in the Ukraine context. And then there are other contexts where I think, Central African Republic in particular, Mali, where you've had large scale massacres where the Wagner group has been present. There's going to be more work ahead. But the first is just that individual liability, trying to get people in place and time and to see, were you there at the scene of the crime? Did you do it?
Right. Excellent. Fascinating topic. You all have done some really, really incredible work. The depth of your awareness of what this is and what it means. We really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us. For those of you, I know Rishi and Matthew, I know how to reach you. Donald, if you've got a question and you want to email Candace, her email address is easy enough to find. I suspect if you want to fire that away, it's a good question, but it's more complex and we have time to answer. I try to keep it to an hour for the purposes of our very busy guests. We appreciate it very much. That was fascinating. You and I will have long conversations, I think, in the future about this too, Candace, because there's still more to uncover here. We'll have you back in the fall and keep progressing through our discussion on the Wagner. Appreciate your time, and we'll see you again. Ben, very nice to meet you, and thank you for taking the time to share with us. It was really great to see a lot of MAG students and MAG's alum in a participant in the attendee panel. That was awesome. If you're interested in the MA in Global Security, be sure to look us up. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Thanks, folks.